In tonight's Dorchester segment, the news is dominated by two major development projects on the Columbia Point Peninsula and near Glover's Corner. To fill us in, we'd like to welcome the news editor of the Dorchester Reporter, Jennifer Smith. Thank you very much for being with us, Jennifer.
Thanks for having me.
Jen, I want to start with a story that just broke this morning, and this is right next to UMass Boston at the former site of the Bayside Expo Center. So what's going to happen?
Yes, so Dick Galvin and Kirk Sykes, so their group, Accordia Partners, will be picked as the developer. The UMass Board of Trustees and also the UMass Building Authority both voted today unanimously to pick them as the developer for this 20-acre parcel that's sort of been up in the air for quite a few years. It's this prime area. UMass Boston initially bought it for $19 million back in the day. They're going to be purchasing it for anywhere between $192 million and $235 million. So as people pointed out at the actual announcement of the pick today, 10 times what you initially put in on an investment is not really a bad deal to get out of it.
Well, what could also happen from this deal, at least down the line, is that UMass could be one of the tenants on the property, but what else could be going on there?
Sure. So the plan itself is sort of deliberately vague because, as anyone familiar with actual community processes around Dorchester and especially around Columbia Point knows, one thing neighbors and the campus community really don't like is being told that there's something rigid that they just have to kind of get on board with. And in fact, during some chats with the UMass Boston officials before the announcement, they said there were the possibility that some people would come in with a more rigid plan that would almost be a disqualifying thing in and of itself. So what we're looking at is basically a seaport style mixed use, partially housing, partially maybe lab space or tech space. But it's really supposed to kind of interact with the campus community. As you noted, the campus itself does retain some rights. It's a 99-year lease. It's not that the whole land was sold. So it means that if, for instance, they wanted a new home for their nursing program and thought that there was an opportunity to do that on the Bayside site, they would be able to work with the developers to see if that would actually work out. So going forward, we're in for a whole host of meetings between not just the campus groups, but also local civic organizations, elected officials, and probably also stakeholders in that broader Morrissey Boulevard, Columbia Point area.
Well, the location is great because it's near the Red Line, but it's also near a really big choke point for traffic at Kosciuszko Circle.
Yeah.
And there's some money here for infrastructure, so what are we talking about?
This is interesting. So one part of the bid that actually set it apart from Lincoln Partners, who were the second considered for it, who made it down to the finalists, is Accordia is actually proposing $25 million for infrastructure, kind of broadly. And so I asked them about this at the announcement. What does that go for? And they're actually sort of proposing it as almost seed money. They're hoping that if they put this in, that also brings in encouragement from the state, for instance, to make commitments to, for instance, not only maybe consider some bond bills or other financing to go toward the area, but really kind of hold their feet to the fire and say, look, we know that this is going to be sort of a strain on infrastructure. You've got housing, you've got potential mixed use. We have Kosciuszko Circle, and we also have JFK UMass, which is not in the best condition. So this is kind of the start of what would be a substantial chunk of money that would eventually need to go to making that entire intersection area a little bit more palatable for the people that need to use it.
One thing I'm interested in hearing you talk about is that you at the Reporter wanted more information about this land disposition process earlier on. What did you want to know, and why did it matter to the community?
So one of the reasons that we kind of pushed on this is because the last thing they were considering for this site, and it was just, again, kind of in this conversational phase, was the idea of a stadium. And the discussions that kind of tend to happen around state property holders, specifically UMass Boston, is they are by their nature exempt from the normal city processes. So normally if you have something of this scale, they have to, put out a public bid. They have to go out and have meetings. They need to explain what they want from it. And the fact that this time around, they did ultimately decide that there would be a robust community process after the selection of the developer didn't quite ease everyone's concerns. And actually, one of the areas where there's been a lot of pushback has been from the faculty that was also hoping to be more involved in the initial picking process. Chancellor Catherine Newman was involved and did get to offer feedback as it got toward the final stages. But I think from a journalistic perspective and sort of from a civic engagement perspective, there was a certain amount of trepidation that you're just kind of supposed to trust the entity at its word with something that could be, a $200 million landfall and really redevelop one of the last major waterfront parcels in Dorchester. So that was mostly where we were kind of keeping an eye on
I was
it.
also intrigued by their rationale for not telling you more, and that was simply that if they told you more, it would knock down the sale price, probably.
Yeah, that's a big one, is basically the idea that if you disclose what the bids are, if you disclose what the plans are, then that basically gives the competitors more information. So it was saying that it would make a less competitive and advantageous process if things were actually disclosed publicly. And that's not an uncommon argument, but it's one that, as far as the reporter editors were concerned, didn't hold all that much water.
I know you mentioned some of the unhappiness on some of the faculty members. There was one enthusiastic reaction from the city councilor, Frank Baker.
Mm-hmm.
He says this could really unlock transportation issues. There's a lot to be unlocked. I mean, was he overstating that maybe?
I don't know if it's an overstatement. I think it's kind of a wish list, basically. I mean, he and State Senator Nick Collins both kind of have this dream for that part of Columbia Point to be kind of a new gateway into Dorchester. But for that to happen, you need to be able to access it, and you need to not be overwhelmed when you're trying to drive up Morrissey Boulevard or come in through JFK or make your way through Kosciuszko Circle or, navigate a sometimes flooded Day Boulevard. So when he's talking about it as a way to unlock transportation for that area, he's really talking about this as a kind of do or die moment, is you either fix the infrastructure or you're looking at infrastructure hell going forward.
Well, turning to Glover's Corner, it's not exactly waterfront property, although it's not very far from the water.
That's right.
Lots of land there and lots of meetings so far. And you've got some people who are they're not satisfied with this latest plan.
Yeah, so to kind of put this in context, you have the Glover's Corner Planning Initiative, which has been going on for about 2 years now, which is looking at a wide swath of area in between Fields Corner and all the way up to roughly Savin Hill. But inside of that is a project that has been very familiar to anyone who's followed this for the last 6 years, actually, which is the Doppler project. It's about 4 acres of space. It's dead in the middle of Glover's Corner. And it actually got Boston City approval back in 2016 with its original plan. It was 4 buildings and a parking garage, 300 some units of housing. It was going to have a supermarket, that sort of thing. Gerald Chan, the billionaire who not only obviously is involved with the T.H. Chan School of Health at Harvard, but has also been kind of buying up property in Glover's Corner, he came on board in late 2016 as the primary investor in that site and kicked off an entire new redesign. So the project team just refiled a notice of project change saying, we're actually going to move that entire parking structure underground. So it opens up more green space. It means that we actually have room for more housing. They're looking at roughly 500 units, 488, I believe, a good chunk of which will be affordable at slightly lower rates than the city requires. And they also want to make a shift over to neighborhood retail more than a supermarket. Now, the interesting thing about the timing on both of these projects is that an anti-displacement and pro-affordable housing group, Dorchester Not for Sale, formed around the Glover's Corner planning study, and it hadn't existed when Doppler was initially going through the process. So a meeting on Monday that was attended by almost 200 people was actually this group's first chance to weigh in on the Doppler proposal, and they don't think it has enough affordable housing.
Well, I know the developers, they must be meeting a standard that was laid out previously by the city, but at the same time, don't they have a point? Because you put this in, it's going to have a ripple effect on other housing in the neighborhood too.
So that is the concern, basically, is the estimate was that it would cost roughly $4 a square foot as far as the actual prices of these units. They're anywhere from studios to 3 bedrooms. And it's a pretty big project. Now, the argument against it is when you drop this amount of more expensive housing into the area, it does have a ripple effect on the surrounding home prices. To kind of compensate for that, what the developers say is they are actually slightly higher than the inclusionary development requirements. They're at about 13.5% of the units are going to be affordable, and the city only requires that it be affordable at 70% of area median income, which includes way beyond Dorchester, which has a lower income rate than a lot of the other areas of the city. So they're saying, yes, we're going to have some at that 70% income rate, but we're also going to have some at 63%, 50%, and even down at 45%. And then they also want to instate a local priority program. So if you live within 3/4 of a mile of that property, you would actually be given priority status if you were interested in half of the units.
And from another perspective, of course, you've got people in the Victorian homes up in Jones Hill. They look at the renderings and they say, there's too much brick.
Yes, that was one of the big things is Shirley Jones with Meeting House Hill Civic Association pointed out, like, yes, it'll probably have like this nice dynamic impact on the community. It's going to bring in new things. But she actually walked up to the little cardboard model of it and pointed at where her house was and like, all I'm going to be able to see outside of my window is brick. So.
Another thing coming down the line here, not too far from Glover's Corner because it's on Dorchester Avenue, is the idea of a Vietnamese cultural district. In a way, this reflects something that's been happening for a long time, doesn't it?
Yeah, well, I mean, of course, if you're looking at sort of the heart of the Vietnamese community in Massachusetts, it's Dorchester, and actually specifically Fields Corner. That's the largest diaspora in the Northeast of the Vietnamese community. And they've been looking for quite a few years now to actually find a way to reflect that in neighborhood signage and kind of local efforts. And they landed on something they thought might work a few years ago, which is a Massachusetts Cultural Council designation. So this is an overlay district that would basically call it Little Saigon, but it would still be at Fields Corner, to basically bring people in, similar to the way the Latin Quarter works in Jamaica Plain, and sort of while they're there to experience the local heritage, they'd also patronize other local businesses, that sort of thing. It's gotten a lot of support from the local Vietnamese community, obviously, but then also a little bit of pushback from those who point out that even though it's a very large Vietnamese diaspora, they aren't the majority either in the area. No racial group actually has a majority in that stretch, and they worry it might be exclusionary to call it Little Saigon. So actually it took a slight step forward recently during the Tet in Boston Festival, which is of course the celebration of the Vietnamese New Year. And Mayor Walsh said that he was actually hoping to start a task force to figure out how to best advance this kind of cultural district designation. That's not necessarily fully in step with everyone in the community. As City Councilor Andrea Campbell pointed out, there are still some people that don't even know the conversation is happening.
This is BNN News, and we're talking with Jennifer Smith from the Dorchester Reporter. Jennifer, what's also interesting right now is that there's some efforts going on to help people who had trouble with the law before. They served time, now they're trying to get a job, and I guess they have trouble with their criminal records, right?
Right. So what recently happened after the State House passed its pretty sweeping criminal justice bill is there's been a greater effort to encourage people to either expunge or seal their criminal records. Now, kind of if you're trying to get a job and you have a quarry, or if you've committed some kind of offense, it can be very difficult. People will sometimes not hire you unless it's a labor job. There are certain amounts of stigma still associated with it. So recently, and including Greater Boston Legal Services, there have been some forums that have been geared toward helping people, particularly in communities like Dorchester and Roxbury and Mattapan and Hyde Park that have been disproportionately impacted, to kind of walk them through the process, not just for expungement, which is a long process, but essentially means that your record is wiped clean, but basically to try and walk them through the process of how you seal a quarry record so that at least it's not coming up in a way that might be detrimental to job applications. And the projections have been rising over the past few years since the actual bill was signed. It's on the upswing. The Greater Boston Legal Services expect about 95,000 people to try and seal quarries this year. So they have pretty regular meetings to sort of walk them through that, but it's a new push.
Finally, Jen, I'm going to ask you about one more construction project, but I guess this is really about education on Pope's Hill, the neighborhood house charter school. What are they doing?
They're trying to expand. They've been in their current property for quite some time now, but they say they don't really have enough room. So they're hoping to expand out. It's about a $12 million project, and they hope to have the new facility open by about 2021, which will give them a little bit more flexibility as far as space and able to accommodate their growing student body.
And finally, Jen, if people want to keep in touch either with you on the feed or Dorchester Reporter, what's the best way to do that?
So the best way to do that is you can either go to .news.com or you can follow on Twitter either the paper at .news or me at Jen.Smith.
Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.
Jennifer Smith from the Dorchester Reporter.